Americans now owe $1.28 trillion in credit card debt, the highest level ever recorded in history. But here's the part that should stop you cold. Because 73% of that debt isn't from vacations or luxury purchases. It's from essentials like groceries, rent, utilities, medicines, and people are going into debt just to survive. Meet Amy, she works full time, she cares full with money, she doesn't take expensive vacations. But last December she had to put Christmas on her credit card. Not because she splurged, but because groceries for her family now cost $250 a week. The same groceries that cost her $130 2 years ago. As she told NBC News, I had to use my credit card to pay for Christmas for my kids. And M is not a financial cautionary tale. M is America in 2026. And here's what makes this story so much bigger than one woman in one city. But before we dive in, I'm Jack Cross, and today we are going to zoom all the way out from Emmy's story to the full picture. And we are going to look at what's happening to Americans' household, what the system looks like underneath the surface, what history tells us happens next, and what smart investors are actually doing about it. Starting with the ground level reality, because the numbers are extraordinary and it's insane that we can't ignore. So total US household debt just hit $18.8 trillion. That's the highest it has ever been in the history of this country. But the breakdown of that debt is what tells the real story, because mortgage debt is the biggest piece, about $13.2 trillion. But non-mortgage consumer debt, credit cards, auto loans, student loans has now crossed $5 trillion for the first time, and according to the New York Federal Reserve, that's a $3.4 trillion increase since 2019 alone. And to put that in perspective, that is roughly the entire GDP of Germany. America added that much consumer debt in 6 years. Now let's talk about prices, because you can't understand the debt without understanding what drove people to borrow. So since January 2019, overall prices in the US are up 29%. But the thing that hurt the most, essentials, are up even more. Housing is up 34%, food is up 34%, electricity is up 41%, and for the lowest income household, those three categories alone make up 64% of their entire spending. Roughly 1 in 3 low income households now spend 95% of their income just on basic needs. And there is nothing left. The grocery store, not the stock market, not crypto, not interest rates. The grocery store is where 54% of Americans say the economy became personal for them. That's from a survey of 1000 US adults conducted in December 2025. And what are people doing when the gap between what they earn and what everything costs keep widening? They are borrowing. Credit card balances rose at an average rate of 9% per year for the past 5 years, and the average APR on a new credit card offer right now is 23.72%. And credit card delinquencies, people more than 90 days behind on payments, rose to 12.7% in Q4 2025. And that is the highest level since 2011, right after the Great Recession. But the student loan situation is even more alarming. So student loan serious delinquency went from 0.70% in Q4 2024 to 16.9% in Q4 2025. That is a 23 times increase in a single year. 1 in 4 student loan borrower is now delinquent. And the fastest deterioration of any debt category in modern US history, and it happened almost silently. So here's a stat that captures the full picture. Incomes since 2021 are up 22%. Debt since 2021 is up 54%. That's a 32-point gap. That's why 62% of Americans making under $50,000 have zero emergency savings. That's why only 7% of Gen Z believes their income will increase this year. That's why 44% of all US consumers say they are not financially prepared for economic uncertainty in 2026. And the American dream used to mean that if you work hard, you get ahead. And right now, the math says the opposite. Work hard, go into debt just to stay in same place. Now let's zoom out from household finance to the government finances. Because what happening to American families is a mirror image of what's happening to the country itself. And the US national debt stands at $39 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio has spiraled to 137% as of March 2026. And the annual deficit, the gap between what the government spends and what it takes in, is running at approximately $1.9 trillion. In other words, the US spends roughly 40 cents more than it takes in for every dollar it handles. And here's the number that almost nobody talks about. The US government is now paying over $1 trillion per year just in interest on that debt. And that's more than the entire US defense budget. Interest payments are now the single largest item in federal spending. And the Peterson Foundation projects the US will hit $40 trillion in total debt by October 2026. And according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the average interest rate on the national debt will exceed the rate of economic growth by 2031. And once that threshold is crossed, the debt grows indefinitely regardless of how much tax revenue comes in, and that is the definition of a debt spiral. This is exactly why the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, whose April 2026 World Economic Outlook was released this week, is downgrading its global growth forecast and issuing explicit warning about fiscal instability. And the IMF isn't some fringe blog, it is the institution that 190 countries turn to when their economies go wrong. And when they issue a warning, it matters. And the Federal Reserve is completely frozen. The CME Fed Watch tool shows a 97% probability that the Fed holds rate unchanged at the April 29th meeting. The same story plays out through June, July, and September. They can't cut rates, inflation is too sticky, and they can't raise rates, the debt is too big. So they are paralyzed. That this is what Alliance economists call the K-shaped economy. At the top, wealthy households benefit from rising asset prices. Their stock portfolios go up, their real estate appreciates, their balance sheets get stronger. At the bottom and middle, households are drowning in high rate debt, squeezed by essential prices that haven't come down, and working jobs that can't keep pace with cost. And the two economies are diverging, not converging. Now here is where it gets really important. Dalio's debt cycle and 1970s comparison. Because everything I have just described, the household debt, the government debt, the frozen Fed, the rising prices, the declining purchasing power, this is not new, this is a pattern. And the person who has mapped that pattern more carefully than almost anyone alive is Ray Dalio. So Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund. He has spent decades studying how countries go broke across centuries of financial history. And his conclusion is this: we are roughly 85% through a long-term debt cycle that began in 1945. And here's how the cycle works. Countries accumulate debt faster than income, masking underlying weakness with borrowed prosperity. Eventually, the debt becomes too large to service, so the government prints money to ease the burden. And that money creation drives inflation. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of the currency. And when confidence in the currency finally breaks, that's when things get ugly. So Ray Dalio draws a direct parallel to the 1970s. After the US broke the link between the dollar and gold in 1971, the government could print money freely, and it did. The result was the worst inflation America had seen in decades. Oil shocks, stagflation, a stock market that went essentially nowhere for a decade in real terms after accounting for inflation. And here's a direct quote from Dalio in a January 2026 Fortune interview. He said debt crises typically develop slowly until it happens all at once. He's also pointed out something deeply unsettling. When he asks why the bond market hasn't revolted yet, his answer is a kind of collective denial. So policymakers assume the bond market won't collapse. Bond traders assume Congress will act before a crisis becomes irreversible. So nobody moves until everybody moves. The 1970s analogy is everywhere right now. Oil shocks from the Iran war, the same kind of supply disruptions that triggered stagflation in 1973. A Fed unable to cut because inflation is sticky, a dollar that fell to a 4-year low. In January 2026, its worst first half performance since 1973. And Dalio himself has said publicly that we are moving toward an inflection point similar to the early 1970s, driven by war, debt, and a breakdown of the monetary order. As Dalio wants $100 in 2025, buys what just $12.06 could purchase in 1970s. That is what happens over 5 decades of managed inflation. And the question is what the next 5 decades look like. So where does this go? And let me be honest with you, nobody knows the timing. But here is what the indicators are pointing toward and what smart investors are watching. So JP Morgan puts the probability of a US recession in 2026 at 35%. That's not a majority view, but it's not a fringe view either. It's more than 1 in 3, and the conditions for that recession: over-leveraged consumer, frozen monetary policy, geopolitical oil shocks, elevated borrowing costs are all present simultaneously right now. And the first thing smart investors watch is consumer delinquencies. Credit card and student loan delinquencies are already at post-2008 level. Auto loan delinquencies are at their second highest quarterly rate ever. And when delinquencies spread from consumer credit to mortgage at scale, that's when banking stress begins. And the second thing they watch is the treasury market. We covered this in our last 2 videos. When foreign buyer pulls back from US government debt, yield spike, borrowing costs rise across the entire economy. And the Fed faces an impossible choice. And the next thing they watch is the labor market. And right now unemployment sits at 4.3%. Elevated but not alarming, but the 12-month average of new jobs added is just 22,000 per month. Historically thin. If that number turns negative, recession becomes the base case, not the tail risk. And here are a few things many experienced investors pay attention to during periods of rising debt and economic uncertainty. First, hold real assets. So gold has returned 65% in the past year. It performs specifically well during late stages of debt cycle when currency confidence weakens. Rather than being viewed only as a short-term trade, some investors consider allocating around 10 to 15% of a portfolio to assets like gold as a structural position, not for speculation but as a way to hedge against the long-term effects of currency devaluation. And the second is think in real terms, not nominal terms. Your portfolio might be up in dollar terms, but if inflation is running at 10% and your portfolio returned 8%, you lost money. And Dalio explicitly urges investors to measure wealth in inflation adjusted terms. Third is shorten your duration. If you hold long-term bonds in your 401k or IRA, rising yield will hurt you. Moving toward shorter-term instruments or real asset exposure reduces that risk. And the last thing I want to leave you with, because this is not just an investing story, Amy didn't do anything wrong. She made the same choices millions of Americans make every day. She worked, she budgeted, she tried to give her kids a normal Christmas, and she still couldn't do it without going into debt. And that is what a late stage debt cycle feels like from ground level, not a crisis on a chart, a woman at a checkout line making impossible choices. And when you understand framework and when you see the IMF warnings, and when you look at the delinquencies number, you understand that Amy's situation isn't a personal finance failure. It's a system that has been slowly mathematically breaking down for decades, and that breakdown is now accelerating. So the question as always is what you do with that information. And here's where we stand in April 2026. Americans owe trillions in household debt, the highest ever. Credit card debt is at the highest ever. Student loan delinquencies are up. Prices of essentials are up. The national debt is heading toward $40 trillion. The Fed is frozen. The IMF just issued a global warning, and read Dalio, the man who has studied debt cycles across centuries of histories, says we are slowly approaching a breaking point, the kind that happens gradually then suddenly. So this doesn't mean you panic, it doesn't mean you sell everything. It means you understand the system well enough to position yourself ahead of it rather than behind it. And that's what this channel is for. If this video helped you see the full picture, do one thing for me, it's subscribe, and it's free, it takes 1 second, and it helps more Americans find this kind of analysis before they need it. And drop a comment below, does this match what you are seeing in your own life, your city, your household? I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next one.